What if I told you that the fictional universe of an alternate history game is playing out in real time on the world stage, shaping the decisions of one of the most powerful men on Earth? Buckle up, because what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you see Vladimir Putin's Russia and the current global crisis. Picture this: it's 1917, and instead of the Bolshevik Revolution succeeding, Russia takes a completely different path. No Soviet Union, no Stalin, no Cold War as we know it. This is the world of Kaiserreich, a beloved alternate history modification for strategy games where Germany won World War I, and Russia became a democratic federation, struggling to reclaim its imperial greatness. Here's where it gets chilling: the political dynamics, territorial ambitions, and geopolitical strategies of Kaiserreich's Russia mirror Putin's actions with uncanny accuracy. It's as if someone took the game's script and handed it to the Kremlin as a playbook. Let me take you back to my first encounter with this revelation. I was researching Russian foreign policy patterns when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. The territorial claims, the justifications for expansion, the rhetoric about gathering Russian lands, it was all there in Kaiserreich, written years before Putin's most aggressive moves. In the Kaiserreich timeline, Russia emerges from its revolutionary period as a wounded giant, desperate to restore its imperial borders and influence. Sound familiar? The fictional Russian Democratic Federative Republic faces the exact same existential crisis that Putin claims to be addressing today: the humiliation of lost territories and diminished global standing. But here's what shocked me most: the specific strategies employed by Kaiserreich's Russia to regain power are being implemented in real time by Putin's administration. The game's Russian paths include options for reclaiming Ukraine, asserting dominance over Belarus, and confronting Western powers who stole Russian influence during moments of weakness. When I dove deeper into Putin's own statements, the parallels became undeniable. In summer 2022, Putin directly compared the current war to the imperial conquests of 18th-century Russian Tsar Peter the Great, and claimed to be returning historically Russian lands. This isn't just nostalgic rhetoric, it's a direct echo of Kaiserreich's narrative framework. The fictional game presents Russia with multiple political paths: democratic restoration, monarchist revival, or radical transformation. Each path shares one common goal: the restoration of Russian greatness through territorial expansion and spheres of influence. Putin has essentially chosen the authoritarian imperial path, using democratic language to mask imperial ambitions. Consider this terrifying parallel. In Kaiserreich, the Russian government justifies expansion by claiming ethnic Russians in neighboring territories need protection and reunification with their motherland. Putin's agenda is wider than conquering Ukraine, driven by what experts identify as ethno-nationalist motivations, driven by a sense of a historic mission to rectify perceived injustices and to regather lost Russian lands and Russian communities. The game's mechanics reveal something profound about imperial psychology. When playing as Kaiserreich's Russia, you're constantly managing the tension between domestic stability and external ambition. Every decision involves weighing international consequences against the burning desire to restore historical boundaries. Putin faces this exact dilemma daily. What makes this even more disturbing is how Kaiserreich predicted the specific methods Putin would use. The game includes mechanics for hybrid warfare, information campaigns, supporting separatist movements, economic warfare, and gradual territorial acquisition. Every single one of these has been deployed by Russia since 2014. The economic dimension is particularly revealing. In Kaiserreich, Russia struggles with modernization while maintaining its imperial character. Throughout the country has been haunted by its relative backwardness, particularly in the military, a challenge that continues to plague Putin's regime despite massive military spending. But here's where the fiction becomes prophecy. Kaiserreich's Russia ultimately faces a choice between internal development and external expansion. The game suggests you cannot successfully pursue both simultaneously. Putin seems to have chosen expansion, and the results are playing out exactly as the game's mechanics predict: international isolation, economic decline, and domestic instability. The psychological profile of Kaiserreich's Russian leaders mirrors Putin's documented mindset perfectly. Putin is said to be influenced by the imperialist ideology of Eurasianism, which aligns precisely with the geopolitical philosophy embedded in Kaiserreich's Russian political options. I found myself asking, did Putin's advisors study this game, or does the game simply capture timeless patterns of Russian imperial behavior? The answer might be both. Kaiserreich's creators drew from real historical patterns, accidentally creating a perfect model for understanding Russian geopolitical psychology. The most chilling aspect is how Kaiserreich shows Russian expansion as inherently destabilizing. Every territorial gain creates new border tensions. Every liberation generates international backlash, and every victory plants the seeds of future conflict. Putin's Russia is following this script with devastating precision. Let me share a personal revelation that crystallized this connection for me. While analyzing Kaiserreich's diplomatic mechanics, I realized the game perfectly captures Russia's fundamental strategic dilemma. How to be simultaneously a European power and an Asian empire, a modern state and a historical continuation, a regional hegemon and a global player. This impossible balancing act explains Putin's seemingly contradictory policies. He's not being irrational, he's following the logical progression of imperial restoration that Kaiserreich maps out so precisely. The problem is that this logic leads inevitably to conflict with the existing international order. The territorial mechanics in Kaiserreich reveal another disturbing truth. The game shows that once you begin territorial revision, stopping becomes nearly impossible. Each successful annexation validates the strategy and creates pressure for additional expansion. Russia still holds considerable sway over countries in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. But the net effect of its war against Ukraine has been a loss of regional influence, exactly as Kaiserreich's mechanics predict. What terrified me most was discovering how Kaiserreich's multiple endings all involve Russian territorial expansion, leading to major global conflicts. The game's logic suggests that a revisionist Russia cannot coexist peacefully with the current international system. Putin seems determined to prove this thesis correct. The economic warfare tactics are particularly well modeled in Kaiserreich. The game includes mechanisms for using energy exports as political weapons, manipulating commodity markets, and leveraging resource dependencies. These aren't just game mechanics, they're Putin's actual foreign policy tools. But here's what gives me hope. Kaiserreich also shows the ultimate failure of pure imperial strategies in the modern world. Every aggressive path eventually leads to international coalitions forming against Russian expansion. We're seeing this pattern emerge in real time with NATO expansion and increased Western unity. The game's internal politics mechanics are equally prophetic. Kaiserreich shows how imperial adventures can temporarily boost domestic support but ultimately drain resources needed for modernization and development. Putin's declining approval ratings despite military victories follow this pattern exactly. I want you to consider something that kept me awake for nights. If a fictional game can predict Russian behavior with this accuracy, what does that say about the predictability of imperial decline? Kaiserreich suggests that Putin's strategy contains the seeds of its own destruction. The diplomatic mechanics in Kaiserreich reveal why Putin's Russia struggles with alliance building. The game shows that revisionist powers inevitably alienate potential partners by threatening the stability that makes cooperation possible. Russia's deteriorating relationships with China, India, and even traditional allies follow this pattern. Here's what shocked me about the timeline correlations. Major Kaiserreich events often preceded similar real-world Russian actions by years. The game explored scenarios of Russian intervention in Ukraine, conflicts with Western powers, and economic warfare long before these became headlines. The military mechanics are perhaps most revealing. Kaiserreich shows Russian forces as potentially powerful but ultimately limited by economic constraints and technological gaps. The performance of Russian forces in Ukraine matches the game's predictions with disturbing accuracy. What really convinced me of this connection was studying Putin's speeches alongside Kaiserreich's diplomatic options. The rhetorical strategies, historical justifications, and emotional appeals are virtually identical. It's as if Putin's speechwriters used the game as a reference manual. The cultural dimension is equally important. Kaiserreich presents Russian identity as fundamentally tied to territorial control and sphere of influence. Putin has successfully weaponized this cultural programming, making territorial expansion seem like existential necessity rather than political choice. But here's the most important revelation. Kaiserreich ultimately shows that imperial strategies fail in the modern world because they're based on outdated assumptions about power and legitimacy. Putin's Russia is following a script written for a different era, which explains why his actions seem simultaneously logical and self. The game's economic modeling reveals a crucial weakness in Putin's strategy. Imperial expansion requires massive resource investment that could otherwise fuel domestic development. Russia is choosing prestige over prosperity, exactly as Kaiserreich's mechanics predict for aggressive players. I found myself wondering, does Putin realize he's following a predetermined path? Or is he trapped by the same historical patterns that the game's creators identified? The evidence suggests that imperial psychology creates its own momentum, making rational calculation increasingly difficult. The international response patterns in Kaiserreich match reality with frightening precision. Every Russian action generates predictable Western reactions, creating escalation spirals that benefit no one but arms manufacturers and extremist politicians. We're watching the game's conflict mechanics play out in real. Here's what you need to understand about this revelation. Recognizing these patterns gives us predictive power. If Putin continues following Kaiserreich's imperial path, we can anticipate his next moves and prepare appropriate responses. The game becomes a strategic planning tool for defending against Russian aggression. The technological aspects are equally revealing. Kaiserreich shows Russia struggling to modernize while maintaining imperial structures. Putin's difficulty developing high-tech industries while funding military expansion follows this pattern exactly. Imperial priorities conflict with innovation requirements. What fascinated me most was how Kaiserreich captures the psychological burden of imperial nostalgia. The game shows Russian leaders constantly comparing current achievements to past glories, creating perpetual dissatisfaction regardless of actual progress. Putin embodies this mindset perfectly. The alliance mechanics in Kaiserreich explain why Russia struggles to build lasting partnerships. Imperial powers naturally threaten their neighbors, making stable coalitions impossible. China, India, and other potential Russian allies maintain distance for exactly this reason. They've learned Kaiserreich's lessons about imperial behavior. But here's the ultimate revelation that changed my entire perspective on current events. Kaiserreich isn't just predicting Russian behavior, it's mapping the inevitable decline of imperial thinking in a multipolar world. Putin's Russia represents the last gasp of 19th century geopolitics in a 21st century context. The game's victory conditions reveal the fundamental flaw in Putin's strategy. Success requires either complete domination or peaceful coexistence, but Putin has chosen a middle path of partial revision that satisfies neither goal. He's locked into a losing strategy by his own rhetoric and commitments. So what does this mean for you, for all of us watching this global drama unfold? Understanding Putin through the Kaiserreich lens gives us tools for prediction, preparation, and ultimately, peaceful resolution. The game shows that imperial cycles have natural endpoints. The question is whether we can reach those endpoints. Without catastrophic conflict, I challenge you to look at current events through this framework. Every Putin statement, every Russian military move, every diplomatic initiative becomes predictable when you understand the underlying imperial psychology that Kaiserreich captures so perfectly. The creators of Kaiserreich may have accidentally created the most important strategic analysis tool of our time, a playbook for understanding and countering Russian imperial revival. The patterns are clear, the outcomes are predictable, and the choices we make now will determine whether we follow the game's darkest scenarios or find alternative endings. What do you think about these shocking parallels between a fictional game and real-world geopolitics? Have you noticed other examples of alternate history predicting actual events? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective on whether Putin is consciously following this imperial playbook or unconsciously trapped by the same historical patterns that inspired the game. If this analysis opened your eyes to new ways of understanding global politics, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Next week, I'll be diving into how other fictional scenarios might be playing out in real time. And trust me, you won't want to miss what I've discovered about China's grand strategy. The truth is stranger than fiction, and fiction might just be our best guide to understanding the truth. The patterns are everywhere once you know how to look. The question is, are we brave enough to see them? Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.